This is the Brandon Smith Show, and of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith, and the entire purpose of the show is one singular thing, and that is to help you live a life that much more free from dysfunction. So for today, we're going to talk about that wonderful, exciting event that happens to almost all of us in our careers. That is both a point of joy, but also a point of anxiety and stress, and that is you've just been promoted to the new boss. And what are some things that you can do? So to help us on this journey, I have got a friend of mine from New York, Naphtali Hoff. And Naphtali, thank you so much for joining us. We are so glad to have you here.
It's my pleasure, Brandon. Really, really excited to be with you this morning.
You and I have been kind of following each other on LinkedIn for some time, and I am so glad that I'm able to kind of have you on the show and educate us, because you've written a whole book on this.
I did, and I'm delighted to be with you because the stuff you post on LinkedIn is fantastic, and I'm always excited to watch what you're doing, inspiring leaders and helping people grow. So whatever contribution I can make to this conversation, I'd be delighted to do so.
Well, let's see what we can cook together in our kitchens today.
Sure.
So to make sure I've got all your titles right, you're both an executive coach, you're author, speaker, organizational consultant. I mean, you wear a lot of hats as you're kind of out there trying to make the world better.
Yes. And all of that actually grew out of my experience in school leadership, which is an interesting pivot that I think a lot of people look at and they go, how did that happen?
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll have a chance to get into that as well.
But
as you can see in my core, I'm an educator. And that, for better or for worse, is sort of how I kind of made my way to where we are at the moment.
So now is one of my favorite parts of all these shows is story time, because I get to hear from my awesome guests about their background. So how did you get into this? What has been your journey up to this point, and what kind of triggered you to say, yeah, I really want to dedicate my life to helping other people become better leaders?
So I think the answer to your question, Brand, it started probably about 20 years ago. At the time, I had been studying abroad in Israel as part of my post-high school, pre-college studies, and I started really to think about my career again. During my high school years, LA law was all the rage, and I thought for sure I was going to be a high-profile lawyer. That was kind of my thing. And then, I started to think about it again, purpose. Maybe I wasn't thinking exactly in that language as a teenager, but I really wanted to make sure that whatever I chose to do would be something that would bring me not only the financial capacity to live and provide and all of that, but to provide deep down for my sense of purpose as well. And so I got into education part-time, and it kind of morphed into something bigger. My wife is from Chicago. I met her. We moved there. I had a teaching opportunity presented to me right away, and it kind of grew and grew administratively until I was really pivoting into school leadership exclusively. And in fact, I think we mentioned this in our pre-recording conversation. We were quote-unquote neighbors for a few years because I was running a school in the Atlanta area. And that is, that was, I think you would say, the nexus or the highlight, if you will, of my school leadership career. But at the same time, for a variety of reasons, in terms of some of the stress involved, in terms of, having the freedom to do what I really wanted and move away from some of the aspects of the position that I didn't really want to do as much, I decided, maybe it's time for me to look at it from the other side of the vantage point, if you will. In other words, I was starting to work with coaches and consultants myself, and I was starting to see the influence and the benefit that they were providing for me. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could sort of broaden my reach, broaden my impact, be able to provide for people in a meaningful way, but do so where I had the freedom to choose who I would work with and how we would engage.
Yeah.
So I still love to teach. I still love to educate. The coaching at its core is really driven by that. Writing is driven by that. But at the same time, I can do it in a variety of ways and continue to build my own brand and connections so that I can meet really neat people like you and have great conversations without having to worry about, are the buses running on schedule? Where is everybody? Do we have any teachers out of the building today? Which parent is calling with a complaint, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the stuff that you sign up for, but you don't really want to be dealing with. So that's the beauty, of what I do now. And that's kind of like the backstory of how I got here.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you that school leadership role, when I've worked with individuals who've had that kind of role, that is a tough job. That's a tougher job than people realize. It is a hard job. A lot of politics, a lot of relationships to manage, a lot of influencing in that kind of world. I mean, it's hard.
And I'm still in that world to a large degree. A lot of my clients are education-based, and I'm actually just embarking now on a book project to publish with an educational agency, a large educational organization that publishes quite a bit, but specific to delegation.
Wow.
And delegation is a topic that I know is relevant to all of your listeners, because all of us, whether we're delegating at home, delegating in the office, regardless of the size of our team or anything else, it's a really, really critical skill, and you need to know how to do it, when to do it, etc. But at the same time, as I'm doing my research for this book, I'm being reminded of the 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks that many principals are putting in, the challenges that they deal with their communities, etc. So, in writing the book, for example, that we referenced briefly before, just that was, in effect, the book I wish I would have had when I was getting started in my principal position. Because I had transitioned from something smaller. It was similar, but it wasn't quite the same. And so if you're pivoting, for example, even within the same organization, but certainly if you're leaving and moving to another one, there's so much to learn. And even though there's a lot of similarity between perhaps what you did do and what you're now going to be doing, there's also typically quite a bit of difference. And coming in prepared is so important because, as you know, Brandon, those first 90 days, 100 days, whatever we call it, usually we think of it on the political landscape with the presidents and whatnot, but it's so important for every leader. Michael Watkins has written about this in great detail, and we know others have as well. Yeah. But how do I make sure that when I first walk into my new position, that I'm building relationships, that I'm understanding the culture, that I'm communicating effectively, that I'm really listening and listening deeply, and doing all of those things really, really well so that I have those relational pieces in place so that when I start to roll out my agenda, I've got people who are receptive to it. Using the ideas, for example, of John Maxwell, I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care, that concept, and kind of building off of it. So it's like a soft skills starting point in many cases, unless, of course, it's a turnaround situation. But assuming that you're not dealing with that type of environment, to be able to work yourself, ease in slowly but steadily to the point where now when you're ready to roll up your sleeves and go to work in a deeper way, you have the capacity, you have the support, you have the interest and the enthusiasm to really put that wind behind your sails and get moving.
So that's a great segue into your book, because I really want to spend some time focusing on that today, because you've got some really good nuggets in there and thoughts in there around what people can do. So what are maybe a few important points for my listeners when they get this awesome, exciting, and yet stressful, anxiety-producing new opportunity where they say, hey, we want you to take on this new leadership role? It's a lot of emotions. What are some things that they need to think about doing that's going to really set them up for success?
So some of them we talked about briefly before, like going in with the right mindset, communicating well, everything from your verbal to nonverbal presence. How do you communicate verbally? Yeah. What do your nonverbals have to be? How do you position yourself in good conversation? So people really are connecting with you and you with them, understanding their backstory, visiting them on their terms, in their turf, wherever you can. Things like this that really starts to build connection. But another thing that I think is so important is to get a mentor or a coach. They're not the same, but I think both of them could be very, very powerful and valuable, especially at the beginning.
Okay, so let's go ahead. Let's dig into that. So if someone says, okay, well, that's an interesting point. They're not the same thing. Which one do I need, and where do I go get one?
So I can't say with a definitive rule of thumb which one you need. They're very different. I would say both of them have value, but we should distinguish between the two. To me, a mentor is someone who's been there. Somebody who's walked a mile in your shoes, understands your role very well, could advise you on what to do and what not to do. It's almost what we'd call the distinction between coach and consultant, with a focus on the consultancy side. But instead of a consultant walking in and saying, this is what your business needs, and here are your areas of weakness, et cetera, and establishing systems and whatnot, it's really more personal. And it's helping you to bounce ideas off of somebody. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Have you considered this, et cetera? And obviously, there are good mentors, and there are not such good mentors. And in the book, I talk about some of the differences between the two. People who are reliable, who'll be there when they say they'll be there, that they're really giving you of their time, and they're focused on you. They're not playing with their phones. They're not dealing with other crises back in the office.
Yeah.
They're able to commit to you in a way which actually works. One of the things that I dealt with, very, very well-meaning individual, was out in L.A., seasoned veteran principal within my, let's call it, network or community of Jewish Orthodox, they're called day schools, independent schools. But at the end of the day, he was a busy man, and he wasn't getting paid to provide me with his mentorship. Not because I wouldn't have, it just wasn't the original arrangement, and predictably, he kind of fell off the grid. And when I really needed some of that mentorship, he wasn't really available or accessible for me. So it's really important that you establish from the outset what the mentor's role is, what the mentee's role is, and the mentor also needs to know that they're not walking in to basically live vicariously through their new tutor, through the new protege, or through the new boss that they're training. They have to be able to give that person space as well.
Yeah.
So that's on the mentoring side. Coaching is more about asking the right kinds of questions, and not only being a sounding board, but being able to put it back in the lap, if you will, of the new boss as they're considering things. What are the best possible strategies? Well, if you do this, what would be the implications? And what do you think that your board president, in this case in the school environment, for example, would think about that, or your, somebody else within your organization, your company, et cetera. So it's a little bit of a different purpose, and the coach is typically a professional coach. You want that, obviously. So they're going to be, it's a paid engagement. It's a little bit of a different focus, and oftentimes coaches don't know the specifics of your particular industry. So a mentor, ideally you want someone from your industry that they really know the ins and outs. A coach often doesn't have that background of the specific nuance of the industry. They just know people and relationships and these kinds of things. And oftentimes I tell my clients it's actually better in many ways for me to know less about your business than you do, so that I don't take anything for granted. I'm able to ask the kinds of questions that really get to the heart of the matter, where you personally, you might have just made an assumption, and you sort of have that as your operating default assumption. But either way, whether it's a coach or mentor or both, having somebody in your corner that really is invested in your success, not a member of the board, not a member of your leadership team, not somebody else that just is, maybe a nice person but may have their own agenda, but really somebody who's committed to you and can ensure that you do everything possible to succeed. I cannot overestimate or overstress the value of having such a person, especially at the beginning.
And I think after you kind of went into a deeper dive and described each, I loved your opening description of saying a mentor is more like a consultant, and then a coach is a coach. So I love those two, because the coach has more of a personal leadership vibe and feel to it, and the mentor has a little more of a systems and organization, here's the stuff you need to be aware of kind of vibe to it. I love that. Okay, so we believe it or not, we've already hit our first break. So we're going to go into break, and when we come back from that, I want to go even more into what do we need to do as a new boss. So we've thought about relationships, because we've talked about that. We've come in with kind of that right mindset and try to care for people. We've got ourselves either a mentor or coach or both. Then now what? So right after break, we're going to dive into that. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hey everyone, this is Brandon. I hope your 2018 is everything you'd hoped it would be. That said, we could all use a tune-up. Go to my site, theworkplacetherapist.com, www.theworkplacetherapist, all one word, .com, for a library of resources for you. You can find past shows, blog posts on navigating workplace dysfunction, and even my TED Talk on the contagiousness of emotions in the workplace. And that's not all. There are the Workplace Happiness Workbooks to help you find happiness in your job, and even a tab to Ask the Therapist, where you can ask me anything on your mind. We all need a tune-up once in a while. Get yours today. Welcome back from break. Of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith, and this is The Brandon Smith Show. And before break, we were talking about that wonderful opportunity and stressful opportunity becoming the new boss. And so before that, Naphtali and I were talking about some of those things that are critical, and you enlightened us in the importance of building the right relationships and coming with the right mindset. You enlightened us around getting a mentor or a coach or both and the difference between the two. All right, so let's say now we've done that. What's next?
So I think now comes the hard work. I know that sounds kind of crazy,
I was
considering how hard everything has been until now.
Thinking I've already done the hard work. Wow.
Yeah, well, you know the story with Steve Jobs, and there's stories of similar others as well. I think you see that in the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, a number of different books. The idea where the new boss walks in and they're able to, sort of enjoy the honeymoon period. It's not easy. But there's a lot of slack given to a new boss at the beginning because nobody expects you on the first day. Nobody wants you on the first day to all of a sudden really put all these various things into action. You need to kind of like earn your chops a little bit, build the trust as we've talked about. But at some point, the day of reckoning is going to come. At some point, everyone realizes you were put into this position for a reason. And you have to identify what are the proper, don't just make change for change's sake, but what are the opportunities? First of all, start accumulating wins. Small wins are great, little things that you could do to enhance the work environment, make people feel more valued, etc. But eventually, you're there to really drive the organizational mission forward, whether that's revenue and sales or whether that's advancing an academic program or advancing some other nonprofit-related program. There's something you're there to do. And there's something the organization needs you there to really provide. So now you've got to start to pivot and think about, well, where are we going? Sort of, charting the course and what are the next steps in terms of direction. But once you figure all of that out, which is itself a challenge to do, you then have to think about who are the people that you have in place. Are they positioned best for success? And to whatever degree that change is required, how do I manage that in a way that produces the desired outcome, but not in a way that sort of throws upsets the apple cart excessively?
Okay, so I have a question for you around all this.
Go ahead.
And I found this is a fascinating idea for me because I think you're so spot on, and I hope people listen really closely to what you said about eventually that time will come where they're going to want to see results. Yeah. Here's the subtlety in this. I found that depending upon the organization, the size of the organization, the kind of industry, that timeline can vary on when you're expected to deliver results.
Sure.
So it's kind of like, if you're like in a startup, you better start delivering results right away. However, if you're in like higher ed, if you start moving too quickly in the beginning and you haven't gotten the alignment of tenured faculty and they're like, whoa, you're going too fast.
Whoa, slow this guy down. That was my problem, by the way.
Yeah,
that was me.
Yeah. So do you have any kind of thoughts? Because I've seen sometimes that moment is day 3. Sometimes that moment is day, 203.
Yeah.
How can you tell?
So I would say 2 things, Brandon. Number one, hopefully you know your industry. You may not know exactly what the new job requires, but you know the industry in most cases. It's kind of rare for somebody to jump, let's say, out of the corporate space into the nonprofit world or vice versa, or even within, let's call it corporate industries, to be pivoting in such a dramatic type of way. So you usually know what the pace of change is in various organizations, and you should be having, I talk about this actually earlier in the book, towards the beginning in terms of managing expectations for yourself and for those who hired you. What is a reasonable time frame for the kinds of things that we want to see done? Now, it's pretty rare for somebody to start a new position and nobody knows what needs to be done, and we're just going to go figure it out, and then we'll come back and revisit this conversation. In most cases, people already know what the issues are or what they'd like to see happen. So I think you can go into those initial conversations with a sense of realistic, let's call it runway. How much time do I have in order to convert between when I walk in the door and start to see meaningful progress? But at the same time, to have the presence of mind and the inner confidence and the open lines of communication with whomever you report to go back and say, you know what, I think it's taking more time than we need, or I think I can move this a little bit faster than we first discussed. But here are some of the challenges you could possibly anticipate based off this change in strategy. Because there are going to be, especially if I need to move something along sooner than I anticipated in a culture that doesn't always support it, you, as my supportive network, whoever that may be, need to be aware of the fact that there's probably going to be some pushback around it. So the more that you could be cognizant of all the moving parts from the beginning, keep the communication open, recognizing that there's nothing etched in stone, but it's going to have to be a fluid conversation around the realities on the ground, you know, the real players, the real personalities, the real dynamics, the real market factors, et cetera, then we can continue to adjust the target so long as everybody realizes that we're operating in good faith and we're doing what industry experts, whether that's the mentor behind me, the coach that I'm working with, the team that supports me, the board, whatever it might look like, all feel that this is strategically right. It's just a question of how do we adjust things in order to really fit the nuance of the situation.
I love that. I'm a clarity geek. So I love the fact that you talk about clarifying expectations, and then everything you said in there was really about monitoring that and aligning that along the way. Checking in, making sure, getting your right support network, other stakeholders kind of constantly updated and aligned on that. So they don't
I totally learned that from experience, Brandon. I mean, I'm not telling you because I think we all do. Expert.
I think we all do.
It was you probably know, I'll just mention this quickly, I'm sure it's not a real story, of the guy who comes to the banker really wildly successful and he says, "Sir, you've been so successful. How did you achieve these incredible accomplishments?" And he says, 2 words, good decisions. And then the guy turns back and he says, "Well, how do you make good decisions?" And he says, 1 word, experience. And then he says, "Well, how do you get all that experience?" And he says, 2 words, bad decisions. And that's just the way it is. And the purpose of my book and conversations like you know, with you and your expertise, et cetera, all of that is in order to allow people to cut down that learning curve just a little bit so that they don't have to make all the same mistakes that people like me made along their journeys.
I love that. So
that's kind of how I see it.
I'm watching time, and I think we have enough time for one more nugget. So I'm excited. What's another nugget from your book that you could say to the listeners to say, all right, so we've got to come in the right mindset. We've got mentor, coach. We've clarified on when results need to happen, and we're kind of aligning around that, managing our support network around that. Now what?
So there's a short term and a long term. I'm going to mention both and then come back to the first one. Okay. The short term is learn how to delegate and use your team effectively. The longer term is think the long game, because this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so on the back end, very quickly, make sure that you're thinking about balance, you're thinking about values, you're thinking about what this is all for you in the long term, because sometimes we burn 2 ends of the candle really quick in our quest for success. So we get really, really focused, and we kind of forget about the long end of things. But coming back to where I was before on the delegation side, you need to know what's appropriate for delegation. You need to know how to do it, where to do it, when to do it. And I talk about that, and I actually just posted something on Smart Brief as well, Smart Brief on leadership, to go deeper in that particular area. But the main thing I would say, Brandon, is don't be afraid to delegate. And not only don't be afraid to do it, make sure that you do it. Because so many folks need to do it and don't. And they think that it's because they can do it better than anyone else, or it takes time to train people, whatever their reasons are, and they're legitimate reasons. It's not like they're just making something up. But at the end of the day, you're one person, and expectations today for leaders are higher than ever before. And we need to be 1,000 places at once. And even with social media, and even with cloning, and even with whatever technologies, we can't be. So ultimately, if you want to bring your authentic self to as many places as possible, you need to be able to find techniques, whether it's John Maxwell's 10-80-10 rule, whether it's other, whether it's Ken Blanchard and his approaches in the 1 Minute Manager. However you approach it, it ultimately has to be where you have good people around you, and you're leaning on them, and you're using their expertise ultimately to allow you to advance all the things that have to happen so that your organization can really, grow and prosper.
Yeah. But it also means the hard part of the job of a leader is also to trust people and to let go of the steering wheel a little bit. Say,
That's
okay,
right.
I'm going to let you drive, and I'm just going to sit over here.
And you can do it slowly, just like a student driver. You don't have to necessarily let them ramp it up at once. But eventually, over time, it is a process.
Yeah.
But you will find that they'll bring their creativity. It'll raise engagement. It'll improve morale. People will stay with you longer, even if they may have opportunities to pivot elsewhere with maybe better benefits, better base salary, other reasons that people would oftentimes look for something different. But if they feel valued and trusted and empowered in your location, in your organization, they're typically going to hang on longer because ultimately, while salary is a motivator and so are benefits, as you know, the main factors for folks to be where they are and to stay there for the long term are the emotional and relational pieces around their position.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, believe it or not, we're getting close to the end here. So I ask all my guests this question. For one life hack that we can take away and put in our toolkits to make our lives that much healthier, either personally or professionally, and that much more free from dysfunction. So what's your life hack for us?
Okay, I don't know if this is a novel hack per se, but I'm going to just power it through because I think it's critical. Get yourself an Audible account.
Oh, cool.
Absolutely love listening to books. I live in the New York area. Traffic, congestion, other factors are real. There's a lot of commuting time. I happen to travel around by car, so I could just pipe it in through my system. But I listen to such great quality audio, self-help, business development, goal setting, just inspirational stuff, history, you name it. I've got all different types of books that I'm listening to, and I could hear it again and again. It sort of powers through my subconscious, and I could refer to it in a variety of different ways. And if I had to actually sit down with a book, as much as I'd love to do so, just knowing the way that I operate, knowing my schedule, it just wouldn't happen. So instead of putting on the news, which can be okay, and by the way, not just audiobooks, listening to great podcasts like yours is another way.
That's a great plug.
That's
a great plug.
You got it. I love those plugs. And by the way, I have a podcast as well, Lead to Succeed,
Amen.
which I'd love for everyone to check out. But the point is, listening to great conversation or great content that you can, instead of just listening to the noise, because there's always political noise, I'm a big sports fan, so I've got sports radio going sometimes, but I have to remind myself, stay focused and get through various content that's ultimately going to help me and my business grow.
Yeah. Naphtali, you are awesome. This was fantastic. So
Thank you.
You hinted at this a little bit, but if people, and I know they're out there listening to this saying, I want to learn more about this guy, or I want to get a copy of his book, where can they go to learn more about you or even get a copy of your book?
That's very kind, Brandon. So the center hub for all of it is my core website, impactfulcoaching.com. They can find
impactful coach.
Impactful, so it's impact, F-U-L, coaching, all one word.com.
Right.
You got everything there, including a link to my book, but there is a dedicated website for the book called becomingthenewboss.com. Very creative. Okay. But it works. And they can find it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other online retailers as well.
Impactfulcoaching.com or becomingthenewboss.com. Either place, depending upon where they want to go to get more of you.
That's right.
Awesome.
That's right. And
awesome.
I'd love to connect on social media as well.
Yeah.
Love to hang out over there.
And if you're not following him on social media, folks, you got to. Great stuff. Thank you. He's so active and vibrant in there. It's fantastic. So thanks again for coming on. And thanks again for listening and watching the show. Until our next show, of course, you can follow us on theworkplacetherapist.com. Download us on iTunes if you're not doing that. Watch us on Facebook.com and Facebook Live. And so many other ways to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. So if you're not following us in all those places, you need to. And until next week in our next show, have an awesome week and an awesome life.